It was supposed to be a perfect Christmas Eve, family gathered around the tree, the smell of fresh pine and baked ham filling the air, laughter echoing through the living room. My wife, Amelia, was glowing in her red sweater, carrying trays of cookies to the kids while I watched her from across the room, a drink in my hand and a smile on my face. For 8 years, this was our tradition, every detail perfectly curated to feel like a scene from a holiday movie. But this year, something felt different. Not bad. Not good. Just different. I couldn't put my finger on it. The air between us wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. Maybe it was the stress of the holidays. Maybe I was overthinking. The party was in full swing, my parents swapping jokes with Amelia's uncle, the younger cousins taking selfies in front of the tree. And then, there he was, Evan. Amelia's coworker. Her friend. The guy she always talked about in passing but never in detail. Evan had been invited to the party this year. Amelia mentioned it casually a week before. She said it with the kind of ease that made me think it wasn't a big deal. And maybe it wasn't. He arrived with a bottle of wine and a big smile, charming everyone in the room within minutes. I'll admit, I liked him at first. He was funny, polite, and seemed genuinely happy to be part of our little celebration. Still, there were moments that made me pause, tiny things that didn't seem to matter then but stayed with me. The way his eyes followed Amelia when she moved around the room. The way they stood a little too close when she laughed at one of his jokes. The way she brushed her hair back when she talked to him, a habit she never had with me. At one point, I caught them in the kitchen. Nothing inappropriate, just talking. It was a fleeting moment, and when they noticed me standing there, they both smiled as if to say, "Hey, everything's fine." And maybe it was fine. Maybe I was imagining things. But you know how sometimes, a small detail sticks in your mind, refusing to let go? This was one of those moments. I shook it off and returned to the party. After all, it was Christmas. But as the night went on, I started to notice more. Things that seemed insignificant on their own but began forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. Little did I know, that night would mark the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Looking back now, it's clear how much I missed that night, how much I chose not to see. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, whether you're ready for it or not. And for me, it came crashing down in the most unexpected way. But before I get to that moment, the moment that shattered everything, I need to take you back. Back to where it all began, when everything seemed perfect, or at least, close enough to perfect to ignore the cracks. Amelia and I met 9 years ago at a small cafe downtown. She was sitting at a corner table, lost in her book, while I stood in line fumbling with my wallet. When I finally got my coffee, I couldn't help but glance her way. She looked up and smiled, and that was it. I was hooked. From the beginning, she had this warmth, this energy that drew people in. She made you feel like you were the only person in the room. For years, I believed that energy was ours, something she reserved for me alone. And maybe that's why I didn't notice it sooner, that she shared that same energy with everyone, including him. We got married 3 years after we met. It wasn't a flashy wedding, just close friends and family, held at a small vineyard on a sunny afternoon. I remember standing at the altar, watching her walk toward me, thinking, I'm the luckiest man alive. And for a while, I truly believed that. Our life together was steady, predictable, and filled with routines. Weekday dinners in front of the TV. Sunday mornings spent reading the paper. The occasional trip to visit her family upstate. It wasn't the kind of life you'd write stories about, but it was ours. And it worked, until it didn't. About a year ago, she started mentioning Evan. It was casual at first, a story about something funny he said at work or how he helped her with a big project. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? He sounded like a decent guy, and I trusted her. But then, the mentions became more frequent. He'd come up in conversations about her day, her plans, even her jokes. I remember one evening, we were sitting at the table, and she laughed at a text on her phone. When I asked what it was, she said, "Oh, it's just Evan being Evan." She didn't even look up when she said it. Just Evan being Evan. Looking back, I wonder if that's when it started, when the boundary between them blurred. Or maybe it started earlier, and I just wasn't paying attention. Either way, I didn't feel threatened. If anything, I was glad she had someone at work she could count on. Relationships are built on trust, right? And I trusted her. Completely. There were little things, though. Things that, at the time, felt insignificant but now stand out like flashing neon signs. Like how her phone was always face down on the table. Or how she started working late more often, always with the same explanation, "It's just a busy season at work." I think the moment I first felt it, really felt it, was at her office holiday party last year. She invited me, of course, and I went. It was one of those corporate events where everyone's trying to network and drink just enough to be fun but not enough to embarrass themselves. Evan was there. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and complimented my tie. He was polite, charming even. And yet, there was something about the way he talked to her. Not in what he said, but in how he said it. Like they had their own language, their own rhythm. It wasn't jealousy, at least not then. It was more like curiosity. I remember thinking, is this just how coworkers are? Or is it more than that? But I brushed it off. I mean, what kind of husband would I be if I let one conversation plant doubts in my mind? Still, that night stayed with me. I didn't say anything to Amelia about it. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument, that I was overthinking things. But as the months went on, that feeling of curiosity, or whatever it was, started to grow. It was small things at first. How her laughter was just a little too enthusiastic when she talked about him. How she seemed distracted at home, like her mind was somewhere else. But every time I thought about bringing it up, I stopped myself. I didn't want to be the jealous husband. I didn't want to be that guy. Then came Christmas Eve. When she told me Evan would be joining us, I didn't think much of it. The more, the merrier, I said. And I meant it. But as the night unfolded, as I watched them interact, all those little things I'd been ignoring came rushing back. I told myself I was imagining it. That there was nothing to worry about. That Amelia loved me and would never do anything to hurt me. But as I stood there, watching them talk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see. Trust is a funny thing. You spend years building it, brick by brick, believing it's strong enough to withstand anything. But all it takes is one crack, one moment, to make you question everything. That night, I started to feel the cracks. And as much as I tried to ignore them, they were there, waiting for me to see them clearly. That night at the party, it felt like the cracks in our relationship were whispering to me, daring me to pay attention. But even then, I kept brushing them off. After all, this was supposed to be a celebration, a night filled with joy, family, and love. Not suspicion. The house was alive with chatter and laughter. My mom was in the kitchen putting the final touches on her famous casserole. The kids were racing through the living room, their faces lit up with excitement. And there was Amelia, moving between guests, her face glowing as she made sure everyone felt welcome. For a moment, I let myself believe everything was fine. That I was overthinking again. But then I saw them. Evan had arrived late, as Amelia said he would. When he walked in, she was the first to greet him. I was standing by the fireplace, talking to my brother, when I noticed her expression. It wasn't dramatic, nothing anyone else would have caught, but I knew that look. It was the same look she used to give me. A mix of warmth and excitement. He handed her a small gift, something wrapped in gold paper, and she smiled, one of those big, genuine smiles that seemed almost too much for a casual gesture. She placed the gift on the counter and gestured for him to follow her into the living room. And that's when I started to feel it again, that creeping unease, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Throughout the evening, I watched them, not intentionally at first, but they made it hard not to. They were always within a few feet of each other, laughing at shared jokes, exchanging glances that felt familiar. At one point, I saw them standing near the Christmas tree. Evan was holding a glass of wine, and Amelia was leaning in, her hand lightly touching his arm as she spoke. It was the kind of touch that seemed innocent, but when you've been with someone for years, you know the difference. You know when something is more than what it seems. I tried to rationalize it. They're just friends, I told myself. This is how she's always been, friendly, open, warm. But as the night went on, the rationalizations became harder to hold on to. I started noticing little things, like how they seemed to move through the room together, always aware of where the other was. Or how, when she laughed at his jokes, it was the kind of laugh that lingered just a little too long. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew better. I'd been with Amelia long enough to recognize the signs of something unspoken, something hidden. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was late in the evening, and most of the guests had either left or were gathered in the den, watching a holiday movie. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after the kids, when I overheard their voices. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their laughter carried through the hallway. I peeked around the corner and saw them standing near the back door, their faces close as they talked quietly. I couldn't hear everything, just snippets. So much fun, always make me laugh, wish we had more time like this. And then I saw it. He reached out and touched her hand, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough to make my chest tighten. Enough to make my mind race. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to walk in, to interrupt whatever was happening, to ask her what the hell this was. But another part of me, the part that wasn't ready for the truth, kept me rooted to the spot. When she noticed me standing there, her expression changed. It was subtle, a brief flicker of something, guilt, maybe. Or surprise. She smiled and walked over to me, her voice light and cheerful. "There you are," she said, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't seen what I just saw. I forced a smile and handed her a plate of cookies to take to the guests. For the rest of the night, I played my part, the doting husband, the gracious host. But inside, my mind was racing, replaying every moment, every interaction between them, trying to piece together what it all meant. I told myself I'd confront her after the party, that we'd talk it out and she'd explain everything. But even as I made that decision, I couldn't shake the feeling that I already knew the answer. That this wasn't something that could be explained away. By the time the last guest left, the house was quiet again. Amelia was in the kitchen, tidying up, humming a Christmas tune like everything was normal. I stood in the hallway, watching her, feeling the weight of what I'd seen and heard pressing down on me. I knew that once I opened this door, there would be no going back. And yet, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The cracks had become impossible to ignore, and the truth was waiting, just on the other side of the silence. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her move around the kitchen as if the night had been nothing more than another family holiday. The way she smiled to herself, the way she hummed that tune. It almost felt cruel. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Amelia," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt like it was about to cave in. She turned to me, her face soft and welcoming, but there was something else, something in her eyes that flickered for just a second when she saw my expression. "We need to talk," I said. She laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Can it wait until morning? I'm exhausted." I shook my head. "No. It can't." Her smile faded, replaced by an unreadable look. She put down the dish she was holding and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Okay," she said, her tone cautious. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were racing, but I knew there was no turning back now. "It's about Evan," I said. Her expression didn't change, not at first. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to figure out where I was going with this. "What about Evan?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "What's going on between you two?" I asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face unreadable. Then she laughed, a soft, almost nervous laugh. "Are you serious?" she said. "Evan and I are just friends. You know that." But her laugh didn't feel right. It felt forced, like she was trying to dismiss something she didn't want to address. "I saw you tonight," I said, my voice firmer now. "The way you looked at him. The way you touched his arm. The way he touched your hand. That's not how friends act, Amelia." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down, her lips pressed into a thin line. And in that moment, I knew. Even before she spoke, I knew. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes glistening. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. "Then tell me," I said. "What is it? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look innocent." She sighed, running her hands through her hair. "Evan and we've been spending a lot of time together at work," she said. "He's been going through some things, and I've been there for him. That's all it is." "That's all it is?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Then why do I feel like there's more you're not telling me?" She hesitated again, and that hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at her, waiting for her to say something, anything, to explain what she meant. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" I asked, my voice low and trembling. She looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. "We got too close," she said. "It started as friendship, but it turned into something more." I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "How long?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. "How long has this been going on?" "A few months," she admitted. "But it didn't mean anything." "I swear, it didn't mean anything." Her words only made it worse. How could she say it didn't mean anything when it had meant everything to me? I turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. My mind was racing, trying to piece together everything I'd ignored, everything I'd chosen not to see. The late nights at work. The sudden closeness with Evan. The way she'd been distant, distracted. It all made sense now, but it was the kind of sense I never wanted to understand. "Did you sleep with him?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer right away, and the silence was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "No," she said. "It never went that far." But I didn't believe her. Not completely. And even if it were true, the emotional betrayal was enough to shatter everything we'd built. "Do you love him?" I asked. The question felt like poison on my tongue, but I needed to know. She shook her head quickly. "No," she said. "It wasn't like that. It was just a mistake. A terrible mistake." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was just a mistake, that we could somehow move past it. But deep down, I knew the damage was done. The trust we'd built, the life we'd shared, it was all tainted now, cracked beyond repair. I stood there in the silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to make sense of the mess that had become my life. But instead, I just nodded, turned, and walked out of the room. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, if I even wanted to try. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. That night, I slept on the couch, not that I got much sleep. My mind was racing with 1,000 questions, but no answers came. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, over and over, as if trying to find some hidden meaning in her words, something that would make it all make sense. But the only thing I felt was the emptiness. The next morning, the house was quiet. Amelia didn't come downstairs right away, and I didn't go up to check on her. I didn't have the strength to face her. Instead, I sat in the living room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the Christmas tree we'd decorated together just weeks ago. It felt meaningless now, like everything else in our life. When she finally came downstairs, we didn't speak. She moved through the kitchen, avoiding my gaze, and I didn't try to stop her. It was as if we were strangers, living in the same house but existing in completely different worlds. A few hours later, I packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. She watched me from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face pale. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't look at her when I answered. "I need some time," I said. "I need to figure out what I'm feeling, what I want." She didn't try to stop me, and for some reason, that hurt more than anything else. It felt like she was letting me go, like she'd already made peace with losing me. I walked out the door without looking back. The first few days were the hardest. I stayed with a friend, someone who didn't ask too many questions, which I was grateful for. I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. I wasn't ready to admit to anyone, even myself, that my marriage was falling apart. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. I thought about the life we'd built together, the promises we'd made, the love we'd shared. And then I thought about Evan, about the way she'd looked at him, the way she'd confessed to something I never thought I'd have to face. It felt like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, I started opening up to my closest friends. I needed to say it out loud, to hear the words outside of my own head. "She cheated on me," I said one night, the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. My friend nodded, his face full of sympathy. "I'm so sorry," he said. "What are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? Could I forgive her? Could I ever trust her again? Or was this the end? The answers didn't come easily. Every time I thought about confronting her again, about asking more questions, I felt exhausted, like I didn't have the strength to face the truth any more than I already had. After a week, Amelia called me. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Can we talk?" she asked. I hesitated, but I agreed. We met at the house, the place that used to feel like a home but now felt like a battlefield. She was waiting for me in the living room, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," she said as soon as I walked in. "For everything. For hurting you, for betraying your trust. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make it right." Her words were sincere, but they didn't bring me any comfort. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you do it?" She looked down at her hands, her shoulders shaking as tears fell down her face. "I don't know," she said. "I was lonely, I guess. I felt like we were drifting apart, like you didn't see me anymore. And Evan, he was there. He made me feel wanted." Her words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her that she was wrong, that I'd always seen her, always wanted her. But deep down, I knew there was some truth in what she was saying. We had drifted apart. We'd let life get in the way of our connection. But did that justify what she'd done? Did that make it okay? We talked for hours that night, more honestly than we had in years. She told me everything, every detail I didn't want to hear but needed to know. And when it was over, we sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging between us like a storm cloud. I told her I needed more time, that I couldn't make a decision about us right then. She nodded, her face crumpling with emotion. "I'll wait," she said. "As long as it takes, I'll wait." But as I walked out of the house that night, I knew in my heart that waiting wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, and some things couldn't be fixed. In the weeks that followed, I started the process of letting go. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. There were moments when I thought about calling her, about trying to find a way back to what we had. But every time I picked up the phone, I remembered the look in her eyes when she told me about Evan. And I remembered how it felt to know that the person I trusted most in the world had betrayed me. In the end, I made the decision to move forward. I filed for divorce, not out of anger or bitterness, but because I knew it was the only way to truly heal. I needed to rebuild my life, to find myself again outside of the shadow of what we'd lost. Looking back now, I realize that the pain of betrayal doesn't just come from the act itself. It comes from the loss of what you thought you had, the shattering of a future you'd imagined together. But it also taught me something important, that sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go. And so, I let go. Of her, of us, of everything we were. And slowly, I started to find myself again. At first, it was just small things, taking long walks alone, rediscovering the quiet joy of a good book, reconnecting with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of everything still felt too heavy, when the memories of what we'd been and what we'd lost would come rushing back, threatening to pull me under. But piece by piece, I began to rebuild. I realized that for years, I'd been so focused on being part of an us that I'd forgotten what it meant to just be me. I'd forgotten what it felt like to chase my own dreams, to find happiness in the little things that had nothing to do with anyone else. I also started to reflect on my part in what happened, not to excuse her choices, but to understand them. It's easy to paint yourself as the victim, to put all the blame on the other person, but the truth is rarely that simple. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being present in our marriage. I'd let work, routines, and the everyday grind take priority over connection. I'd stopped asking her how she was feeling, what she needed, what she dreamed about. And maybe, in some small way, that created a space for someone like Evan to step in. That doesn't mean I deserved what happened, or that her betrayal was justified. But understanding it helped me find closure. It helped me let go of the anger and resentment that had been holding me back. As the months went by, the pain started to fade. It didn't disappear completely, scars like that don't just vanish, but it became more manageable, more like a dull ache than a sharp wound. I stopped thinking about Amelia and Evan every day. I stopped replaying the what-ifs and the what-could-have-beens. Instead, I started focusing on the future. On what I wanted my life to look like. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream again, to imagine a life that wasn't defined by what I'd lost but by what I could still build. I won't lie and say it's been easy. There are still moments when the memories catch me off guard, when I hear a song we used to love or come across an old photo buried in a drawer. But those moments don't feel as heavy anymore. They don't hold the same power over me that they once did. If anything, they remind me of how far I've come. Of the strength I didn't know I had, the resilience I didn't think I was capable of. And for that, I'm grateful. Not for what happened, but for what it taught me about myself, about love, and about the importance of staying true to who you are. People always ask me if I'd do anything differently, if I'd go back and change things if I could. And the truth is, I wouldn't. As painful as it was, as much as it broke me at the time, it also shaped me. It forced me to grow in ways I never would have otherwise. And now, standing on the other side of it all, I can finally say that I'm okay. That I've moved on, not just from Amelia, but from the pain, the anger, and the bitterness. I've found peace in knowing that life doesn't always go the way you plan, but it still goes on. And sometimes, it leads you to places you never expected to find. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that healing isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's messy and painful and complicated, but it's also beautiful. Because every step forward, no matter how small, is a step toward becoming the person you're meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced something similar, if you've ever had to rebuild after losing something you thought you couldn't live without, I hope this reminds you that it's possible. That you're stronger than you think. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild Love Story and turn on notifications for more stories like this one. And if you feel like sharing your own journey, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Because sometimes, the best way to heal is to remind each other that we're not alone.